Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, it makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus. And you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all. Those are famous words uttered almost 60 years ago on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley by famed orator and dissident Mario Savio, who was a working class Italian kid from Pittsburgh, getting a PhD in mathematics. And those words will frame today's show because we're going to talk about kind of the war at home again, the eruption of college campuses regarding protests against the U.S. role in Gaza, which have been really heightened in the last week or so. And welcome then to a special edition of Green and Red Podcast. And I'm Bob Bazanko, co-host, and we're here with Scott Parkin, our other co-host. Scott.
Hey, happy to be here.
And of course, we have one of our frequent guests who's a good friend of the podcast. And like Scott and I, has a background in higher education, which is what we want to talk about today. This is Clayton Lust, who was on the show a couple of years ago talking about the Camp Logan riots and Confederate statues. And he is a history professor in the Houston area at various community colleges. And so welcome, Clayton, as well.
Thank you. Always glad to be here.
Yeah. Obviously, things have gotten pretty intense in the last several days at campuses from coast to coast, right? The elite in New York and in California, and then places in between, the University of Texas. And so today we want to talk a little bit about that. We want to do a little bit of a background on protests in the 60s to create that historical framework for it, and then just give our opinions, just have a conversation about what we're seeing today, since this is something that all of us are deeply concerned about, since we've committed so much of our time to education, especially to higher education, and we're around it all the time, and we see what's happening on campuses, and it's quite terrifying today. So to get started, we'll just, I think, talk a little bit about the 1960. The statement at the beginning came from Mario Savio, which may not have the same impact now that it did in December of 1964, but it's really important and critical, and it speaks to the heart of what we're talking about today. In context, Savio's speech, the observation he made came within the framework of him talking about the need for civil disobedience among college students in particular, but really within the United States. And he really was speaking more to university politics rather than the war in Vietnam, which will become obviously the dominant issue and really creates a parallel to what we're seeing today. So within that, I think that it's important to have a little bit of a background. I think when you talk about Savio, I think it's also useful to begin by talking about the creation of SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, which was probably, I think you could argue, the most important student anti-war group in that era. SNCC, obviously, the most important civil rights group, and they clearly fit within each other, right? There's a lot of cross-reference there. And civil rights, post the war in Vietnam, and a lot of the early SDS members participated in things like Freedom Rides and Freedom Summer. So there's clearly they're in sync there. But when SDS got started, it said, we are children of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, but looking uncomfortably at the world we're about to inherit. And I think that too is an important framework. So just to get started, why don't you just give some general ideas on what you think about the protests of the 60s, how they fit in today, and then we'll just go from there.
Well, I've been thinking, especially with bringing up SDS, that I think this is very easy to see, but there's obviously a direct line that you can see to connect SDS protests to obviously the Vietnam protests, the free speech in Vietnam stuff, to protests over Watergate. And then more into the modern era, there's obviously a direct line to the Dreamers protests and the stuff about Muslim bans when Trump took office, right up to this sort of stuff, right? Including misinformation campaigns, disinformation campaigns, including the leadership at the top, attempting to minimize the relevance of what these kids are doing, minimizing their intellect, essentially saying you're just a bunch of kids, you don't know anything. And there's one of my family members even mentioned that they were at Kent State and they participated, but one of the things that was, quote, disappointing was how many bad actors there were that joined in all of this. And I was like, that sort of stuff just gives credence to what the ruling class is saying. You're not really furthering the debate by talking about that sort of stuff. And I think that if I could put anything as a punctuation mark here, I'm glad to see that faculty are participating in the ways they are, like at NYU, forming the ring around the protesters. They're doing at Emory, and seeing them get arrested. I'm glad to see parents out there, the person at USC. I'm glad to see that. But I'm also always cautious about this sort of stuff, that we get pissed off and we get everything ruffled when we see parents and leaders, quote unquote, being arrested. We get upset when we see during the civil rights movement. A lot of colleagues don't like when I talk about this, but I don't think it's that big of a jump to make. It doesn't make me feel good when we talk about all of the protests in the 60s, and especially civil rights, and the thousands of people who were lynched in the 20th century. And we finally get somebody on record talking about it when white college students are getting killed. So I'm glad to see that people in power, or whatever little power we as faculty have, I'm glad to see them protesting. I'm glad to see them participating and being on the sides of these kids. But I'm also hesitant. I certainly don't want to pat us on the back too much, because this is still, to me, this is their movement, and something that we ought to be supporting as auxiliary. And I know I'm perfectly content to say, I'm with you, but I'm behind you. Don't put me up front. You guys are the ones who should be up front. And that's where I'll leave my kind of opening remarks.
Scott, in addition to teaching community college classes, you've also been organizing for over 20 years, especially among young people. Mm-hmm. And how does your background fit into what you're seeing today? Is it, you think, the product of a sense of history and the last 20 years? What do you think about it?
I think there's some important lines that go back to 1968. I think there's some important lines that have been happening here that go back to the mid 80s around the anti-apartheid movement. It seems like the boycott, divest, sanction movement actually has a direct lineage to the anti-apartheid movement. And I feel like what we're seeing right now, in a sense, is the BDS movement is come alive in a major way. It's at least 40 campuses, I read this morning, where we're seeing these encampments and these occupations. And then if they're getting evicted, then we're seeing just like lots of protest and civil disobedience. It's also around the world too. I've seen images from the University of Sydney and the Sorbonne and other parts of the world where this is happening. I feel like in the last, probably since the Iraq War, the last 20, 25 years, we've seen these sort of movement moments happen. And in the last 10-ish, 15 years, we've seen Occupy, we saw Standing Rock, we saw Ferguson, we saw a lot of stuff during the Trump era. And I do feel, and then we saw 2020, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But I feel like all of that has been building towards whatever the next movement moment is. I do feel like 2020 is particularly significant for what's happening in 2024. I think the Democrats misread 2020. They saw it as an anti-Trump moment. I actually feel it's a bigger movement, which was critical of the police. I feel like this current incarnation of the movement is critical of international policing, which is us selling weapons to the Israelis and what the Israelis are doing. We talked a lot on this show about how the Israelis are just a cop on the block for the US and the Middle East. And that's what I feel like this is a response to. This younger generation also is not, even at the elite colleges, don't have a lot of hope. Our economy's bad. We've been ravaged by a pandemic. The climate crisis is really starting to go off the rails. And then we pour lots of money into the war in Ukraine and a potential war in Taiwan and give the Israelis a lot of money. We just passed something like $18, $20 billion in aid this weekend. And so what I see is this really important where we move from these different movement moments and they just continue to build momentum. I also feel like that's why the Zionists and the establishment are just like really freaking out right now. A lot of social media right now is a backlash against this, how everyone is a Hezbollah or Hamas secret asset. And they see the momentum and they see the grassroots nature of this. And that's what's freaking them out. That's why they're passing all these laws. That's why they're sending the police in. That's why Greg Abbott and Brian Kemp are trying to be George Wallace or Lester Maddox or whatever.
Yeah. It's deja vu all over again.
And Democratic politicians are too. They just don't want to admit it.
George Wallace was a Democrat, so was Lester Maddox, right?
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. No, I think there are. I think a lot of people sometimes strain to make historical connections, but in this case, it's quite obvious. You have like SDS, I think is comparable to what we're seeing today with Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine, and the need for an organization, which is really critical, and they've done a great job of that. But then you go beyond that, the images like at Ohio State, my alma mater, yesterday, there were snipers on campus buildings on the roofs. And Columbus is only 2 hours away from Kent State University, where the National Guard came out and killed 4 students and shot 11 others. We did a great show on that for the 50th anniversary in 2020. And so you see that comparison. I think a lot of the issues are the same. Clearly, the Vietnam War and now these atrocities, this genocide in Gaza are the major precipitants of action. But there's more to it than that. In the 60s, a lot of the campus protests, even before Vietnam, surrounded things like the CIA recruiting on campus, getting government money for defense. There was the Army Math Research Center at the University of Wisconsin in Madison was actually blown up by Weather Underground members, and one grad student, unfortunately, was killed in it. So I think we're seeing a lot of parallels there, which are important, I think, to understand. Columbia, by a nice historical coincidence, was one of the main powder kegs in 1968, and it is today. And the uproar in Columbia in 1968 was about local issues as much as the Vietnam War. Columbia had property in Harlem nearby, which they were going to take and then drive the people out, the neighborhood's inhabitants, and build a gym. The slogan was "No more Jim Crow," GYMCROW, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of that dealt with things like divesting from companies like Dow, which made Agent Orange and was supplying this to the U.S. troops in Vietnam. I think there's a significant comparison to be made there. In 1968, William Buckley, the famous conservative commentator, said that the protests were simply children looking for an opportunity to rebel. And the other day at NYU, right across the street, basically, we heard Mike Johnson, the Christian evangelical crazy nut Speaker of the House, telling these kids that they need to go home or we should get the National Guard out and all that kind of stuff. And I think we're going to play it.
My message to the students inside the encampment is go back to class and stop the nonsense. Stop wasting your parents' money, Congressman Lawler says. I think that's right. We met briefly with the president and her top officials right before we came out on the steps here. We encouraged her to take immediate action and stamp this out. And our feeling is that they have not acted to restore order on the campus. This is dangerous. They have shouted racial epithets. They have screamed at those who bear the Star of David. Enjoy your free speech. It does not matter who shouts in our faces. We're going to do what is right by America. We respect free speech. We respect diversity of ideas, but there is a way to do that in a lawful manner, and that's not what this is. Mr. Speaker! Those who are perpetrating this violence should be arrested. And I'm here today joining my colleagues and calling on President Shafiq to resign if she cannot immediately bring order to this chaos. As Speaker of the House, I am committing today that the Congress will not be silent as Jewish students are expected to run for their lives and stay home from their classes hiding in fear. In the House of Representatives, we've already acted to address anti-Semitism on campuses. We have passed a number of statutes to address this matter, and we call upon the U.S. Senate to act upon our legislation.
I think historically, it's important to understand this, and also at the most important level, I think, to understand what works, what worked then, what can work today. Because I think we're seeing a lot of this, like I said, deja vu all over again. Now, I know you've both taught, and I suspect you've both taught about the 1960s. I've taught an entire course on the 60s. I've also taught an entire course on radical history of the United States. But when you talk about this in class, like, how do you present it and what kind of feedback? What do you get responses from the students when they hear about this stuff? And let me just give one vignette before I pass it off. The last day of class, I asked my students rather than lecture, I was like, what'd you learn this semester? And it was pretty cool because in both classes, the first thing students said was, we learned that people like us sitting in this classroom actually made a difference, right? They went out there. And so I thought that was pretty cool too. So let me just throw that at you guys now.
I obviously present it as a matter of a continuum of reform in the United States, dating back to mid-19th century reform. And there's a part of it where obviously you can't ignore what average individuals do and how they react and how they, for lack of a better way to say, I hate for you this phrase, but how they make history. You can't ignore that it's not irrelevant that kids got beaten up. It's not irrelevant that people get lynched or anything like that. But I also present it from the standpoint of that you can protest in the United States, but there is a moment in any reform movement where your protest can cross a line for the ruling class. And when it does that, they're going to react, and they're going to react violently, and they're going to react in ways that we saw in the 1960s with National Guardsmen on campuses, and ways that we're seeing right now, in ways that we saw, as Scott mentioned, Ferguson. They're going to react in a certain way. You can say that maybe the police sometimes they go a little too far, but then when you go, maybe the police are the problem and we should get rid of the police, now you've gone too far. Now you can't say that, okay? And so I present it, and I think a lot of students get it. I think they appreciate knowing that it matters that they do these things. But I also have to admit that while I talk about this stuff, I can certainly see in my classrooms, I can certainly see a lot of, but I also don't see a ton of action. One of the campuses that I've taught at, I've taught it at Lone Star Montgomery for now 14 years. And the next protest I see there will be the first. So they're not, I don't know, they're not really radicalized there. So I don't see a lot of action. At Houston Community College, I've seen plenty of action. I've seen plenty of people want to take action, but I've also seen plenty of circumstances where the students probably, and I think this is probably by design because of the way community colleges work. I think the students are hesitant to take the lead in it. That they'll go out and they'll do things, but only if somebody like me or an administrator says, yeah, you guys should go out and protest. Why aren't you out there? Why aren't you out in the middle of the field at in front of the San Jacinto building, demanding that something change? But going out and doing it on their own, I think they've been conditioned that they're not supposed to go out and do that. So you can make headway up here, but it's this way that I think is the trouble, is the problem on some level.
Scott, in addition to teaching, you've also told me in all your years of organizing, because you work with a lot of younger people, that you talk about the movements and the lessons of the 60s, right?
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking about. I mean, it's been 20 years since I've been in a classroom, but I have been as an official capacity as a teacher or instructor or professor. But I've been a trainer in these different activist movements, left movements, enviro climate movements, anti-war movements, 20 years ago and more recently. And the two things, like, I also use that as an opportunity to still get to do some of my history teaching. So I use it as a moment for political education. And so when I talk about the 60s, and then I talk about even more recent movement stuff, I talk a lot about participatory democracy. And there's elements from the STS Port Huron statement, which talks about questioning how society is there for the corporation. It's how it's just trying to turn us into numbers or consumers or what have you. I talk a lot about that in my training. I used to talk about that in my classes when I taught as well. So I actually think that's an important piece. And I think that a lot of college campuses are geared to just make people better consumers. They talk about being better citizens, which I really hate that word anyway, but it's there for the profit margins of a small percentage of people in our society, whether it's corporate execs or university administrators or politicians or what have you. And so the participatory democracy element, I think, is important. And I hate it when I see movements really fuck up the participatory democracy stuff like they did with Occupy, for example. The other thing I talk a lot about in my classes, which I think was pretty important in the late 60s, I think it's been pretty important in a lot of movement stuff. It's something that we talked a lot about in 2020, is this idea of disruption. And so when we begin to see a level of disruption and unrest happening, that's when the ruling class freaks out. We talked a lot about this with Trump. We talked a lot about this with the movements around the murder of George Floyd. And so that's actually where I think we're headed towards, if we're not already there. They don't like that people on America's elite campuses are not participating with the program. They're not along. They're unhappy that their university has a lot of investment in Israel or companies that do business with Israel. And so they're beginning to not cooperate with that. And that's what the ruling class is really freaks out about. If I think we have maybe some numbers on this, but like Harvard, Columbia, if they actually were to divest from companies that do business with Israel or divest with the Israelis, that would be like hugely problematic. Plus, we're also demanding that the U.S. just stop selling weapons to the Israelis. But this is where they get really nervous, is when you start seeing this unrest on the street. And it's not just on campuses. We've been doing anti-war profiteer action since October. We've seen huge marches. There's a lot of pushback and questioning right now of the elite ruling class, government, Biden administration policy around Israel.
And actually, the three of us were present at the creation in Houston. We were all part of the Houston Global Awareness Collective, yeah, which actually started with the issue of war profiteer. Yeah. It was one of the things that started it, right? The protest at Halliburton and everything. So this does go back a long way. I think the stuff Scott just mentioned, what they're learning, I think another part of this scares the ruling class is that I think it really puts a dent in that whole idea of American exceptionalism, which apparently some people still believe in. But in the 60s, that really was frustrating and alien, because in the 60s, a lot of those kids, I call them kids, college students, they're older than me, right? But they came out of a liberal kind of New Deal, JFK background. And so I think they still had this idea that the U.S. was a force for good in the world and was going to go out there and help people. And then Vietnam really put an end to that. And you can see that in some of the statements from people like Paul Potter or others, the SDS leadership. And I think that kind of alienates them too. And then you're seeing that today, right? When you have this intense, increasingly virulent propaganda, the IDF is the most moral army in the world, and the U.S. is a force for good, and Hamas is to blame for everything, and everything started on October 7th and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that's an important part of it too. Ideologically, people are just, the right has somehow harnessed skepticism, which is ironic and terrifying, right? The right has become the vestige of this anti-government rhetoric. And you find a lot of people on the left, or at least liberals, defending the state, right? Defending cops, defending all this shit. And I think these students are really putting a dent in that, which I think is another reason they're so terrified, right? Because it's calling into question this idea. They don't really use the term exceptionalism that much anymore, but I think that's what they're talking about, right? This propaganda. And I think fewer and fewer, it's ironic too, because somebody who's really put a dent in that is Donald Trump, right? Because he's the one who's talking about how shitty America is all the time. So it's screwed up that way. But I think at the Columbia 1968 protest, that was really a big part of it. This idea that the U.S. is not an exceptional state, that the kind of stuff it's doing in Vietnam, it's also doing here, which we're seeing today, right? The juxtaposition. Let's not forget that I think every university in Gaza has been destroyed, hasn't it? So we're seeing what we call scholasticide in Gaza. Now they're bringing the war home, which is why I think the title of this episode should be Bringing the War Home, right? Because that's what they're doing. And we're seeing it. And we saw that in the 1960s too. And the SDS and others made a point of that. And to just one last thing, because we talked about SDS, someone else who's really important in this, who I'm always trying to get students to read, is Wright Mills, C. Wright Mills, and in particular the power elite, right? With that idea of how this isn't a democracy, right? And that's where the idea of participatory democracy comes from. We're not in a democracy. We're in this system where a series of power groups, right? It could be the military, it could be Wall Street, it could be the media, it could be big tech nowadays, right? Exactly.
Yeah. The cloud capitalists is
even if we don't agree with Yanis Varoufakis's major argument, it's clearly an important force, right? University presidents, I think people forgot, like Mills included the universities and labor as part of the power elite. And we're losing sight of that. So it becomes this kind of good versus bad thing, Democrats versus Republican thing. Yes, Scott.
I just want to note that C. Wright Mills was a Columbia professor. I don't know if you said that. It's just an important thing to put out there.
He's a big Texan who wrote a Triumph, and he was a professor at Columbia, and was not well liked by the administrators there either. I think that ideologically we see that connection as well. Paul Potter in 1965, this is what I sent you guys last night, at the first real big, like it was 25,000 people, first major anti-war rally in D.C. in April 1965, said that the incredible war in Vietnam has provided the razor, the terrifying, sharp cutting edge that has finally severed the last vestiges of illusion that morality and democracy are the guiding principles of American foreign policy. And that's exactly what we're hearing today. And I think that really does terrify these, I don't know what you could call criminals, assassins like Abbott and Eric Adams in New York, and the presidents of these universities, and Joe Biden, for that matter. Biden Yahoo, I've taken to calling him just because it's easy. because they've morphed into the same person.
Manoush Shafak.
What's that?
Manoush
Oh, the
Shafak.
president.
Yeah.
Well, these university presidents, we can talk about that later. But before we talk about contemporary stuff, is there anything else you're thinking about with regard to the history of this, the legacy of it, whether it be the 60s, it could be, I cut my teeth on the Central American protest in the 80s. I was, I think, a little more skeptical than most liberals. And I had helped form a campus chapter of Democratic Socialist Organized Committee and things like that. But it was the 80s and Reagan's attacks in like Nicaragua and El Salvador, which really flipped me. Because when I saw when I wasn't really studying Vietnam yet, but I'd been reading about it. It was whoa. And then when I saw that in real time against Nicaragua, which is this tiny country, which was giving kids vaccinations, which, as we know today, is a really horrible thing, and creating literacy programs, and the vehemence with which Reagan went after them really was eye-opening. Of course, the flip side of that is the Democratic Party took a stand. The last time the Democratic Party had an iota of a backbone was in the 80s.
Right.
We saw the anti-apartheid movement, which I think a lot of people make the connection today, although
Columbia was also an early anti-apartheid campus as well.
And Noam Chomsky has often said that you can't compare the apartheid in Israel and Palestine to what was the South Africa. What Israel is doing to the Palestinians is way worse than anything he's done in South Africa too.
Yeah,
I think that's a connection as well. But is there anything else just with regard to that history of it that
I had a quote also, which I just want to throw out there, which is, I think we've used it on the show before, but it's by Dick Flax, who was also in SDS, who said, and I think this is like an overarching theme here too, is that the people who are running society are the corporate liberals. They want to stabilize, not repress. Corporate liberalism means reforms made by the power elite in the interests of social stability, not redistribution and social equality. We're pretty far away from redistribution of wealth and social equality at this point in our society. But it is important to note that there's the Biden-Yahoo types who still think that we can somehow get back to corporate liberalism, even though we're moving more towards this libertarian dream of the Trumps or whatever.
Oh, they're living in the 70s and 80s. Absolutely. Really, time has passed them by. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Clayton.
This goes back a little bit to grad school for me, but when I read Richard Hofstadter for the first time and started thinking about this continuum of violence and the role that violence plays in a lot of this sort of stuff, it made me think, especially preparing for today, that we've got a continuum like this throughout American history about reform and the controlling aspects of reform and the shutting down of protest at not necessarily local levels, but again, the ruling class just killing protest and going after people and shutting down any sort of dissent, going back to even before the 1830s, but you can really say the first era of reform is in the 1830s. So maybe we've got a tradition of violence in this country, but we also have a tradition of repressing any sort of questioning of the ruling class and their motives and their policies and whatever you want to put under that umbrella. There's a tradition of this. It's almost, I don't like to say it this way, but it's almost like that's the American way, not standing up for what you believe, but putting down that sort of stuff is the American way.
Yeah. As much as liberals love to say dissent is patriotic.
Yeah.
Nobody believes that. I mean, they may believe that, but
yeah.
When you try to assume the mantle of patriotism, you've lost, right?
Yeah.
Because they own that one. One last thing about Columbia. Mark Rudd was the SDS president at Columbia, the chapter president at Columbia, and sent a letter to the president, Grayson Kirk, an open letter. And he said that the uprising of Columbia was the opening shot in a war of liberation. And then my favorite line, in the letter to the university president, he said, "Up against the wall, motherfucker. This is a sticker." It became the slogan of the movement. Up against the wall, motherfucker. So,
that's brilliant.
It was a notorious anarchist campaign as a result.
We could name this episode that, but then YouTube wouldn't.
Yeah.
But the other thing, it became Columbia in '68, just like today, became a cause for people on both sides, right? In the '60s, you had people like Norman Mailer and Stokely Carmichael, Tom Hayden, Susan Sontag, who were going to campus. There's an amazing Abby Hoffman. There's a great picture in 1968 of Tom Hayden helping Francis Fox Piven into the building at Columbia. The buildings when they're seized. But I think it's also important to note, and I think this is a good way to launch into what's going on today, unless you have something else to add. The protest in Columbia, it took 7 days for it to reach that. There were negotiations.
In 1968,
right? Kirk was was not sympathetic at all to the students, but trying to maintain stability, which is a really important point, right? And finally, he was under intense pressure from the likes of William Buckley and other conservatives. And it took 7 days to do something, right? Whereas here, it's been pretty much immediate, right? Especially here, like in Texas the other day, which was terrifying. And snipers at Ohio State and snipers at the University of Indiana, and it's happening immediately, which shows the awesome power of the state. But I think it also shows they're scared by all this.
Yeah, you don't show up with that sort of a result or with that sort of plan unless you're scared. That's the only reason you show up with that sort of force.
I do want to about Columbia really quick. I do want to say that I think that the students have been pretty brilliant strategists on this. Is that they started their encampment the day that Shafik, I don't know if I'm saying her name, testified before Congress, where the right-wing congressman berated her about Jewish safety on campus and all of that sort of thing. And she immediately had the NYPD come in and arrest 100 people, which created this media firestorm, political firestorm. And now here we are a week later. It's about a week later now. Seems like much longer. And 40 campuses plus internationally are all doing the same thing. And we're even seeing in Georgia and Texas, and USC, we're even seeing like worse repression, but it's completely consumed them. And now they're in I would actually say the Democrats and the people who have been really supporting this Israeli genocide in Gaza are like really in a hot spot right now as a result. I actually feel like they created a crisis, which is, as a campaigner, that's what you want to do, is you want your opponent to be in this constant state of crisis, because that's when they fuck up. And that's when they make a mistake, and that's when you win. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're in that mode. We're seeing that play out right now in real time.
Another similarity there was that after Kirk in 1968 called the authorities in, and I think they made 700 arrests and they beat students up and all that stuff, even conservatives and the Board of was repulsed by it. Yeah. And it also steamrolled across the country. You saw a lot more protests. In 1970, after Kent State, essentially pretty much every campus in America shut down. But we're seeing that today. A few days ago, a little list came out of like 12 campuses that had encampments. And today, I believe it's 4 times that. It's close to 50. And so thankfully, they're not very bright, because by coming down so heavy-handed against people who are out there, like having vigils and having CEDARs and coming down and cracking down on them, really is. I've seen like professors I know all over the country who I would consider liberal, who are pro-Biden. Some of them are Zionists, and they're even expressing their outrage and their disgust at what they're seeing on campuses. And obviously, that's Greg Abbott's only strategy in Texas, is to overplay his hand and then double down on that.
Yeah.
And so
that's what they did. I would say that's what they did at Emory too.
Yeah, absolutely. So
other reasons, there's another piece that we can talk about in a minute around Cop City too.
Yeah, I want to talk about all that. So let's do that to segue then into what we're seeing today, which is, it's horrifying. I can't say it's really shocking, right? We've seen this for our whole lives. But what do you take out of, and something you, Scott, said that I think is really important, is you talked about the strategy and how they're very smart about this, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important, rather than just say, this is the history of it. I think you also have to say, this stuff works, and this is a good idea to figure out where we're going with this. When you saw these campuses, this has been building. There have been anti-BDS, there have been BDS movements for some time. There have been protests about Israel and Israeli apartheid and investments. I saw an article at Harvard. There were protests against investments in Israel, 5-6 years ago, right? And that also gets to the insane media propaganda that this all began in October of 2023. But just what are your general ideas or thoughts about what we're seeing in the last week or so, especially, but even more in the last several months, but especially the way it just took off and erupted recently?
It's a couple of things. I actually think it's fascinating how this has really caught on campuses. I don't think I've seen college campus sort of activism. It's more than activism, but college campus, a firestorm around an issue like this, and maybe in like 10 or 15 years. And there was a lot of stuff around preoccupy in the early aughts. And so I think that's actually pretty interesting, and how that has really, it wasn't just at Columbia, even though we were seeing a lot in the news about Columbia before last week, about the Jewish safety stuff and the anti-Semitism and professors or students being targeted. And so I think that's actually pretty interesting. I think the moment was ripe for that. The other important thing I think that has happened in the last few months is we know how well how well organized the Israeli lobby is. It's actually really interesting how well organized the Arab and Palestinian communities in the US are, which is what we're seeing play out a little bit. You really saw that play out there, and you're still seeing it play out in some of these Democratic primaries, like states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota and Hawaii, where we're having this sort of no confidence in Joe Biden vote. I think that's a piece of it going on here as well. And that's also really good organizing by the Arab and Muslim communities, Palestinian communities. And then I also think that, like I said, I'm just going to restate this. I feel like 2020 is really an important sort of like the line between 2020 and 2024 is really important. And the Democrats just didn't think that the movement would respond to them the way they did to Trump in 2020. Yeah. And I think it's a complete miscalculation on their part. I also think it speaks to like all kinds of divisions within the Democratic Party, all kinds of problems there. But this BDS movement, and then the anti-BDS movement, which even Alec had template legislation that states have passed, including I think Texas, right?
BDS,
has been like going on for a long time. Yeah. But like I said at the beginning of the episode, is I think BDS has come alive. And no one's saying that as much, but this is the BDS movement really pushing back en masse with direct confrontational action.
Yeah, absolutely. Clayton.
For sure. I don't know. I think it's interesting, speaking of BDS and Students for Justice in Palestine and all of that, and the organization, I'm really glad that they seem to really be they're not taking the bait on the anti-Semitism stuff, which is very good.
I don't know if you want to say it, but may I point out that you're Jewish yourself, right?
Yeah, I am.
So, are you anti-Semitic, or are you?
That's the great question. That'll be the great debate. Forget Buckley and Chomsky. It's the debate in my head about which one I am. But yeah, they're not rising to the bait, and there's a lot of people. I talked a few minutes ago about students being conditioned to certain things. Here in Houston, the executive director of Houston Hillel said about all of this stuff. He said that most people don't have a clear understanding of what anti-Semitism is. He said, short of seeing a swastika painted on a dormitory, it's actually very difficult for people to understand what Semitism is. And then he talked about BDS and basically said BDS is pure anti-Semitism. And the reason it's anti-Semitism is because it creates this double standard where we, quote unquote, are going after Israel for, as he phrased it, alleged human rights violations, but we don't go after everybody else. And I thought we learned in grade school that he did it isn't a valid defense. It's heartening to me to see that whatever these other people are saying and trying to paint this as anti-Semitism, that those who are actually doing the protests, those who are actually engaged, are not taking the bait. And it's also obviously, as I think we've talked about plenty, is that people who are Jewish Voice for Peace and all sorts of other groups are standing right alongside with this, going, no, it's Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same thing. You can't paint us with that brush. And I'll just flat out say it. I know you just said, do you want to say it? But I'll tell you right now, as an American Jew, I'm absolutely anti-Zionism. To me, it shouldn't even be a discussion as far as I'm concerned. But again, it's hard to get away from these things when you're conditioned to them. I know that when I was coming up in Judaism, I will freely admit I'm a convert, but we were told that to refer to, quote, Palestine, or to refer to anyone as, quote, Palestinian, is in and of itself a political statement, and one that you should be very wary of. If somebody says, I'm Palestinian, you should probably run the other direction, because it's just not good. So I think a lot of people get conditioned toward that, and they hear these people like Hillel executives talking about this, and it carries a lot of weight. I know that like U of H's, their chapter of Hillel has basically said about BDS and SGP, not on our campus, it's obviously failing, which is great to see, but they are all over Hillel's page saying, no, not on our campus. So it's heartening to see people not taking that bait.
Jewish Voice for Peace, when I think about it, reminds me in the 60s of VVAW, the veterans,
Right.
because you have people like in this particular case, Jewish Voice for Peace, these are Jews who are saying no.
Right.
Or is another group is going to call something like Not in Our Name or Never Again.
Yes. Yeah.
To
The
them
not in
means
our
never
name.
again. And the point is, as Norman Finkelstein says, that means never again for everybody, not just
Yeah,
never
exactly.
again.
No, it's exactly
Right?
right. That's right.
And VVAW was like that because these are vets, these are soldiers, many of whom have
Right.
been in. And so there's
Yeah.
a certain legitimacy there that is really hard. And so when Netanyahu says these are anti-Semitic mobs, he's
Well,
talking about, I think, a group
talking
that
about
is,
Jewish kids
yeah, at least,
too.
symbolically in many ways led by these Jewish students. They had a cedar on the lawn
Right.
and they're
Right.
anti-Semites.
And that was
cedar
really
and Schumer's front lawn on
And
Passover.
yeah. And that's all great to see because there's commentary in the Haggadah about just this sort of stuff, about the never again, about how you treat people in these sort of circumstances. I'm not crazy about some of the old wording about it, like the you were foreigners in a foreign land. That's not really quote us, but modernized Haggadahs don't say stuff like that. They talk about how what's going on is wrong. I think it's just good to see. I'm happy to see that sort of stuff.
Did it, Scott? You've been on the front lines more than we have. Was it any at all surprising to see the intensity, the levels of violence that were so immediately brought up against these protests? And
no, I feel like we've been seeing this militarization of the police against protests has been really on the upswing for the last 20 or 25 years since the anti-corporate globalization movement and the anti-Iraq war protests, and more recently, and it's not recent anymore, but Occupy and Ferguson and Standing Rock and 2020. I mean, it's none of it's a surprise. In certain places, I believe I read that the majority of the campuses have just been letting them camp out and have their protests and have been leaving them alone. But then there's other campuses where the violence is definitely escalating, and there's probably unique reasons for each campus, but I do think that those outliers though are important to note. Like what happened to Emory in Atlanta, what happened in Austin, what happened in LA, the arrests in New York, and Emory or Emerson in Boston actually had some pretty rough stuff happen too. And snipers on the roof at the University of Indiana and OSU. That's crazy.
Yeah.
But none of it surprises me because they've been just pumping a lot of military thinking into police, which we as well, and lots of money into weaponry.
I was just going to say money and weaponry too. Yeah,
and given the military gives weapons to police departments.
Yeah. So there's a real kind of synchronicity there between Israel destroying Gaza and the universities of Gaza and what they're trying to do here. And it's not just that violence with the cops. It's people like Robert Kraft. The other day I saw a horrific interview with him. He's a big donor to Columbia. He's not going to give them any more money because of the horrible things they're doing. And
it's not safe for Jewish students, right?
It's not safe, right, for Jewish students, although
it's a fucking total trope.
Yeah, absolutely. What else do they have? But you see doxing, these like the guy at Harvard, Bill Ackman at Harvard, but they are doxing students. They're like putting their names, their home addresses, their phone numbers. They're encouraging like white shoe law firms and Wall Street firms not to hire any of these students who participate in an expression of protest, right? And that's the kind of thing that I don't think we saw as much in the 60s. There's clearly always been a blacklist, no doubt about that.
Sure.
But now we're seeing it at levels that are really unheard of before. The doxing, this kind of putting this electronic surveillance. The liberal Democratic governor of New York called for surveillance against students protesting for Gaza.
So did Pelosi.
And what we're seeing now, I think, is heightened, right? It's beyond anything we would have, probably imagined 10 or 15 years ago with this new technology, the doxing, the surveillance by Democrats and Republicans alike. Pelosi has basically told students more or less, like, why don't you go to Gaza and all that kind of stuff. And Eric Adams, the so-called Democrat in New York, and a lot of these police chiefs are African-American and Latino or Latina. And so we're seeing the so-called liberal constituencies. The liberal establishment now is essentially attacking its own people, which we also saw a lot in 2020. On the other hand, I think that the heavy-handedness of the response has been, in some ways, a blessing, right? Because and this is the same way you see this you see it everywhere in every movement, right? The more they attack you, the more people come out. And this is clearly intimidating, right? Because if they wanted to, they could run out the clock. Campuses are going to be empty in 2-3 weeks, right? And most of those kids aren't going to stick around to have an encampment over the summer. They could have just waited it out, but they chose to go in with an immediate, violent full spectrum response.
It seems like what at least some or a majority of the campuses are doing too, just waiting it out to the school year ends.
Yeah.
And then the not smart ones have decided to escalate.
Yeah.
But I want to circle back to something you were just talking about, the doxing and the technology right now. I think it's funny because I think that's the real danger. And I think probably more important in explaining why the United States is so gung-ho to ban things like TikTok. Because, I mean, I think anybody who truly believes that we're on the verge of banning TikTok because China, that's just nonsense. That's just, China knows all of that shit already anyway, if they needed to know it.
They could get it from Amazon.
You can get it from Amazon, from Facebook, from your Chrome browser history, whatever. Okay, so TikTok is not it. But what TikTok is a place where you can get, it's not traditional journalism. It's not connected to in any way to the ruling class. So you get a better version of more realistic version of what's going on in Palestine. You're getting a more realistic version of what's going on in these campuses because you got kids out there going like this and saying, you guys are fascists, and calling them out right as they're doing it and then posting it 2 seconds later so everybody can see it. I also think that's the danger. I think that's the danger of TikTok to the ruling class. I
don't think that like the 19-year-old Israeli soldiers posting their war crimes on TikTok.
No,
which
that
is
was
happening.
Not smart.
Yeah. That'll be one result of TikTok getting banned if it gets banned.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot about social media that I think is disturbing, but what we're seeing now on Twitter and Instagram especially is this instant reporting, and you get to see, or I can't look at many of them, these horrific videos from Jan Kunis, from Rafa. It's great, right? IDF soldiers like holding up women's underwear and children's books. We're seeing these images of these, and that's the real point here. Right? We're talking about this. We're talking about college campuses today, which means we're not really talking as much about what's actually happening in Gaza, where they're finding, and I don't think it's a coincidence. You're seeing these graves, the UN, which I assume they're a bunch of Bolshevik globalists or whatever, but the UN has come out with several reports confirming every time Israel makes an accusation, dead babies, UNRWA, so on, RWR, they're always debunked, but it doesn't matter. And so I think by shifting attention to college campuses in the US, they're hoping that people won't be looking as much. And thankfully, we do have Instagram and TikTok and Twitter to remind us of all that, what's going on. But the truth is out there. And certainly it's a lot easier. You have massive government propaganda. If you read the New York Times or Washington Post, it's so heavy-handed and so obvious. They're not very good at it, frankly. But then you can see in real time, as you pointed out, literally as it's happening, right? In class, I always make jokes about like the Civil War, World War I, and how they were on Instagram and Twitter from scenes from Appomattox or from the Battle of the Marne or something like that, right? But that's what we're seeing today in real life.
That's giving me a great idea for my next 1302. I'll just have them write up act out a TikTok from World War I. Instead of reading something or writing about it or studying the issues, act out a TikTok from World War I. But
and in Texas, in addition to things like doxing, Greg Abbott has issued an executive order saying that all educators, and including college professors, should have to accept I forget, is an ADL definition of anti-Semitism, which is, as you said earlier, it pretty much says you can't criticize Israel, you can't say anything. And I'm not going to sit here and say anti-Semitism never happens.
Of course it does,
but at the same time, they've created this thing where you have to start any statement by condemning anti-Semitism, which of course, but the anti-Semitism that I see is Charlottesville. It's the Tree of Life Temple in Pittsburgh by these neo-Nazis and white supremacists who are really closely aligned to Donald Trump's people, right?
Yeah.
And then you'll see a list of anti-Semitic incidents, and I'm sure there are real ones there, but the ones I see are like shouted from the river to the sea, calling for peace in Palestine. The other day, I forget who it was, they called them murderers and war criminals. It was an elite group of
BDS.
That's the point. It's not a slur if it's true.
And it's a free speech issue. It's not, they're not saying you're Jewish war criminals. They're saying you're war criminals.
Yeah.
Because of what
and
you're doing.
Actually, that's an interesting point that you just made here about it's free speech. And I think without putting you, I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this, but you're my go-to on this sort of thing. But obviously, Ohio State public university, UT public university, but Columbia is not. I don't know about NYU. I don't know whether NYU is private. Harvard obviously isn't public. I don't presume that Emory is public. Yeah. So talk about free speech on private universities, because this isn't a matter of we're not going to let you play golf here because we have our restrictions on who we let in and all of that sort of stuff. This is literally, you're not allowed to say that, and we're saying you cannot say that. And I've been scolded by plenty of people that, hey, you know what, Columbia can do whatever they want. They're a private university, and it's like, legally, yeah, but talk about that, because I know that's a big thing for you. I know that free speech, whether it's a private institution or not, is a big thing. And
no, you don't force. There are certain like fundamental rights, speech, assembly. That's an amendment to that. That's what the Civil Rights Act was about. That's the Americans with Disability Act. Once you have that established, then it does apply to everybody, right? And we've seen many court cases where students have been reinstated or even gotten monetary awards against campuses that do that. So things like the First Amendment aren't like that when we're talking about an expression of political thought, right? I think where it gets squirrely there is when you start talking about hate speech and hate crimes, which I'm probably do deviate from a lot of people on the left. I actually find them somewhat troubling because it creates all kinds of situations that can be used against people. That's the thing about these things too. They're used against people on the left, right? They're used against people like us. And so I'm always wary of people who are on the left trying to turn the tables and use them too. No, you can go to Columbia and say, stop the genocide, that you have a constitutional right to do that. So, yeah, that's just a game that.
There's also like a level of subsidies that these private universities get from the public sector too. Just to put that out there too.
Students get federal financial aid. They get money from the government. Yeah, absolutely. No, but it's a game. It's a ruse.
Yeah. I know that, but I'm just hoping, because I hope that this will get shared more than just, obviously I know it'll be more than just the three of us here, but I'm hoping that some people that I know will actually pay attention to this. And I specifically want them to hear this, that you don't forfeit free speech just because you walked into the doors of a private university. You don't forfeit that.
Private schools can. We're not going to hand out birth control at the student health center, stuff like that. But no, free speech, First Amendment, and there are certain like federal laws which obviously supersede all that, and they're connected to the kind of the way the federal government is structured, as Scott pointed out. They get federal money, they're part of a federal system, they're on financial aid, but it's First Amendment. You don't forfeit the First Amendment because of geography. Campuses. And I'm very familiar with that because in my old file cabinet in my office, I had about 8 letters from the university for having protest outside the free speech zone. Right? Yeah. And it's everywhere. And I think that's really one of the important lessons of the 60s. And what we saw after, they scared the hell out of people who ran the country in all levels, right? Because these kids are out there taking these lessons they learned in classes, especially the humanities. That's why the humanities are getting gutted today, right? But they take all these lessons about like liberty and freedom and the Constitution, and they apply them in their own lives.
Right.
We're going to support the peasants of Vietnam. We're going to support African Americans, Mississippi and Alabama. We're going to try to end this war, right? We're going to end parietas on campus. We're going to have a rally for free speech at the University of California at Berkeley. And that's where Mario Savio gave his brilliant oration. And they saw that, and I think it scared the hell out of them, which is why we've seen this crackdown. We've seen the costs going up. We've seen student debt going up. Debt is a form of political control as well, right? Universities are no one has any issues when education gets defunded, which Abbott is on a tirade about that. He's trying to give everybody $7,000 vouchers for private schools and charter schools. So I think that's the big part of that too, is that it actually worked after the 60s. They engaged in this repression to keep students down. And now the genie's out of the bottle again. I think that's it's terrifying. Look at what they say. You're anti-Semitic. You don't have a right to this and all this kind of shit.
I'm sorry, Scott.
I was just going to say, it's also what's led to this sort of privatization of the commons. It's definitely what began in the 60s on university campuses. But now if you're going to have a march, which should be a First Amendment, you have to have all these permits. Or if you're going to rally in a public space, then you still need all these permits, even though it's private. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But now it's a whole other thing, a whole other show, but it applies to things like homeless people sleeping in tents in public spaces because nothing's public anymore. We're very much eating away as much of that public commons as we can as quickly as possible. We're not. But
no, I don't know specifically what the students today are doing. I would assume that they're going through the channels, but are they just calling? I know, like when I did it, it's easier to apologize afterward than ask for permission. So remember in 2003, I just grabbed a bullhorn and pretty soon there's people in front of the library. And I got letters for that. So what? I got letters that went into my file, right? Like everybody else, all the others. So I don't know what they're doing today. Are they going through, or are they just it doesn't matter. The state's going to get you whether you apply, whether you.
That was the key part about the University of Texas, that they had applied for a permit with the university, and then they canceled it and told them not to do it. And then they brought in Austin police and DPS, state jackbooted thugs, and all that sort of thing.
And that's my point.
I don't know about a lot of the other campuses.
That's my point, though. It doesn't really matter. Like, you can do it. You can go through the proper channels and do it that way, or you can just do it. You can do it spontaneously. Either way, you're going to get pretty much the same response from these people. The only thing they have in their arsenal, and I use that word deliberately, is violence, right? That's what they got. They can't have a debate. All they can do is say you're anti-Semitic, or you're supporting Hamas, or you're a terrorist, or you're a communist, or you're gay, or you're whatever. You're woke. You're a drag queen. You're transgender, whatever, right? That's all they got, because you can't have any kind of debate on this, right? I think it's stunning to me that over 50% of Americans are now critical of Israel. That's unheard of. I mean, it used to be 80, 90% in favor of Israel, right? And in a fairly short period of time, and I credit the students, especially for this, right? They have flipped that entirely. And that may not seem like much, 50% to 35%.
No, it's huge. No, it's enormous.
Huge. That's a massive reversion in just a really short period of time. Yeah. We've been on a while. So last thing I want to talk about a little bit is, what do you think they've done that's working? What, as old timers who've been through it, and we don't need to give them, I think they're doing a great job. I don't think they really need advice from us, but based on what we've done, what we know, what do you think the next step would be? Or just keep doing what they're doing, or how would you go about it if you were part of this?
I would probably be out there just saying, first of all, as I said earlier, I would be very much content to be in the background and say, look, I'm here for you guys, but please don't put me up front. But if I were to go up front, the one thing I'd say is just stay resolute. Stay resolute. Continue doing what you're doing. Tactically, I'm not going to speak to that, because I don't have that kind of experience. But you can see that you're scaring the hell out of these people. And you can see that there's changes that are happening. And Scott mentioned Ferguson early on today. And I remember when Ferguson happened, at that moment, I came into class the next day, and I could tell my students were pissed. They were all pissed. And it wasn't the normal piss. It's a day after an exam or something like that. You could tell they were pissed. And I said, we're throwing out what we're going to do. And we're going to talk about what you're all obviously pissed about. And it was one of the best days. And it was a day that I can honestly say, I've never had a day like that in teaching before, because they clearly got it. So, to circle back, they get it. They do understand it. When push comes to shove, they understand it. And what they need is, especially in my experience where I'm at, is they need the push. So if they've got the push, to me, they just need to stay resolute with it. They just keep doing what you're doing and don't back down. And I know it's hard to go out there and say, look, you're probably going to there's going to be a crackdown, and some of you might get your head split open. Some of us might get thrown to the ground and have our face bounced off of a sidewalk.
But I'm a philosophy professor.
That was the economics professor, but still, it was. Right. She got her face bounced off of that sidewalk, and I was just like, God, that's, but that's going to happen, and you can't let that deter you. You can't just go, oh, somebody got their head split open, so let's walk away. That's when you need to gather. That's when you need to go and circle around and take stock of what you're doing and go, no, we're obviously pissing them off. We're obviously scaring them. So stay resolute.
Scott is a long-time organizer.
Right. I think two things come to mind. One is the sort of pressure and disruption needs to continue, and looking for new points of intervention for that. Go into people's homes, more maybe smaller protests. One thing about this compared to 1968 is in 1968, and this has happened in a couple of places. This happened at Cal Poly, Humboldt, and I think it actually is happening at Emory right now, is that they're actually occupying buildings now. It's not really happening on the other campuses. Looking for different ways to escalate, continuing the pressure on administrations and on politicians and on corporations, I think is going to be really important. But disruption, increasing the pressure, escalation is all important. But then I also think this sort of swarming of different strategies is that the Columbia students have actually filed a civil suit against the administration. Mm-hmm. Like, they need to be doing that in Austin. Mm-hmm. They need to be doing that at Emory. They need to be just fighting it at every level. I think this is the moment where a lot of other movement resources could be mobilizing, whether it's activist lawyers or
And they will, yeah.
or
And that
people like
also that also speaks to the First Amendment issue, right? They have a right. They're entitled to file these suits because their First Amendment rights are being denied, right?
there's only a handful of members of Congress which have opposed these spending bills.
Yeah.
But it's nice to see Ilhan Omar showing up at Columbia and at the University of Minnesota. I think Greg Cesar, who's the squad member in Austin, showed up to stuff there, but also getting the kind of political class a little bit. Those who are supportive, more engaged, there's few of them. So I say that with some skepticism, but still
Yeah.
that sort of element. I think celebrities, whatever, it's just we need to swarm this from every possible direction. And the anti-war profiteering actions, which actually I helped organize one a couple of weeks ago. I think those are actually really important as well because it really draws out the sort of just like brutality of what these weapons manufacturers are doing and what they're selling to the Israelis and Ukrainians and whoever else.
In 1968, STS actually went into, I think, the dean's office, maybe the provost's office, and they put their feet up on his table. They smoked his cigars. They drank his sherry. If they did that today, oof, it would be ugly. I want to say it's because I'm around students, but one thing I want to speak about, which is very important to me, is the role of professors, because we get attacked all the time. We're the Marxists, we're the socialists, we're ruining kids and all that kind of stuff. And my point is always, I wish we were doing all that. But in fact, because I've seen a lot of stuff lately from well-meaning professors who are, I think, supportive of Palestinians, but also are very adamant to say, I never proselytize in my class and I don't teach them anything. And
yes, you do. Every day you do.
Why not then? If you're not, then you should be, right? Because our point is to teach them what's fucking true and what isn't, right? It's cool to see these professors going out there and forming these protective rings around students, which they did at Columbia in 1968 and other places as well. But in the classroom, I teach U.S. history. If what's happening today isn't relevant to the teaching of U.S. history, then nothing is, right?
Yeah.
Because if I talk about the 60s, so I spent a lot of time in class talking about Gaza, talking about the way Hamas is blamed for everything, right? Hamas blew up the Maine. Hamas attacked Pearl Harbor. What we're seeing there, right?
Yeah.
And so I really would hope that professors would get over this kind of false equivalency and let's be balanced and I'm not biased and all that kind of shit. History doesn't occur in an objective, balanced way. History occurs, and you look at it and you tell people what it meant.
Exactly.
And you don't soften it in order to not offend certain people. Right. And when Greg Abbott says you have to use the ADL version of anti-Semitism, people are afraid. I've seen colleagues who are afraid of that. Oh, what the hell's wrong with you? Bring it. And I'm not trying to be like macho. I'm just saying.
When he came out, and I think it was a bill that got passed by the Texas legislature, the anti-DEI bill. And they were talking all sorts of stuff about critical race theory and all of that stuff. I open up, ever since then, I've opened up every first class by saying that you're going to hear something in this class all semester long that some people are going to tell you is critical race theory. I said, those people are welcome to come to my classroom and define critical race theory if they would like to engage in that debate. And I said, until then, I'm going to keep doing what I do, and I'm going to keep doing it until somebody drags me out in handcuffs. And then I follow up with, and I hope they do. I hope they do come and drag me out in handcuffs. That'd be the highlight of my career if they did that. If somebody did that, but you never know. So
if that happens, we'll start a GoFundMe, and you'll become a folk hero.
I'll become a rock star. Hopefully, I won't let it go to my head.
No, I think professors, especially, it really is inspiring, just like it was in 2020 to see. It's because it's young people. Like in 2020, you saw these young people, you saw nurses on the front lines in both COVID and the street riots. Isn't it like young people, like 50% of people under the age of 30, I think, get their news from like TikTok and Twitter and places like that, right? Yeah. So it's a different world. And fortunately, a lot of these guys are fossils and they're heavy-handed. But I really do hope that educators step up. You don't need to like make up stuff or
no.
You just tell the truth.
Absolutely.
We have the receipts on what Israel's done, literally and metaphorically. We know what Israel's doing. We see it every day. We know the United States has given them like nearly $500 billion over the years in inflation adjusted. The U.S. gives them every kind of weapon imaginable. The United States is now building a pier for food, even though there are hundreds of trucks at the border which aren't getting in. I think it's our responsibility.
Or they get shot when they do get in.
Or they get shot when they get in. And again, I think it's important to talk about this, but I think the fact that we're doing an entire episode on this means we're not talking about what's actually happening, which is, I think, part of the plan, right? And which is why I think like these students are really doing some really great work. And I've seen this one issue that's really important to me is gun violence. And young people have taken the lead on that one too. I think we really need to hopefully encourage educators to do that at every level. Like you, Clayton,
Yeah.
I go in first class. I always say, this is C. No one knows what CRT is anyway, but I always tell Greg Abbott to come to class, tell Patrick or Paxton to come to class, and make sure you spell my name. So,
There you go.
Speaking about the sort of horrendous war crime that's happened in Israel, I do have a close whenever we're done, if that's okay around that.
Yeah, no, I think I don't know. My last thought was just going to be also keep in mind that this is not a Democrat versus Republican issue. That both blue and red officials are involved in this repression, right?
100%.
And I'm tired of people like shoving it down my throat. You have to vote for Biden. You have to vote for Biden. He's the lesser of evils. It's, dude, when butchering young kids and babies and making them have surgery without anesthetic becomes the lesser evil, then what's the fucking point?
Yeah, no.
Fucking point with that. Yeah, I think it's important to understand this happening in blue and red states, that it's a bipartisan effort, right? And also, I think it's important to understand, because so many liberals especially love to talk about policing in almost exclusively racial terms, and that's clearly
obviously not. Yeah.
But, and this is something I've said when I teach about the labor wars from the 1870s on, right? The police work for the ruling class, and they will crush anyone who gets in the way. That could be the wall of mobs in Portland. It could be privileged white kids at an Ivy League college. It could be African Americans in Ferguson and Minneapolis and a million other places. But the police, this idea that the police are just a racist institution is really, unfortunately, it's worse than that. They're against anybody who steps in to challenge them. As Scott knows better than both of us.
Absolutely.
You've been in their crosshairs way more than we have.
I think it's also worth noting that what we kicked off with is that in many ways, this is an anti-police movement. It's just the police that were protesting as the Israeli military. It's like the U.S. is cop on the block in the Middle East. And they're just trying to destroy Hamas, according to them. But what they're really doing is destroying like tens of thousands of lives.
And earlier, I think Clayton sent the article from The Intercept about the Memphis police. What was that thing called? The assassination squad, the Cobra squad, or I forget what they were called. Were trained by
It was the Scorpion squad, I think.
The Scorpions, was it? And I believe in Cop City, weren't there IDF consultants there, right?
Yeah, so, the stat is that the original proposal from the Atlanta Police Foundation to the Atlanta City Council was that 43% of the training at Cop City would be done by the IDF.
Yeah. So
which is crazy. They're also wanting to build a Cop City in Dallas. They're wanting to build one in the Bay Area. They're definitely moving towards this militarization of the police.
In the 80s, when Congress started to actually put some restrictions on aid to Central America, Israel came in. Israel set up computer systems in El Salvador and Guatemala for the government to track so-called subversives and murder them and execute them. Israel, I know I have a little bit of a stake in this, because I went through it in a very small and insignificant way in 2002, when on KPFT, I talked about the terrorism going on under Ariel Sharon at the time. And Pacifica, which claims to be a bunch of radicals, walked away. They wouldn't have anything to do with it. So this is a tough issue, and it's really important. And I hate to say this, Clayton, because it almost sounds like some of my best friends are black, but I think as somebody who's Jewish, it's really important, I think, to give us this statement, this personal observation, right?
To me, it's incumbent on Jews. If you are legitimately Jewish, that makes it sound like I'm saying real Jews and not real Jews. But if you believe what you proclaim to believe, it's important for Jews to be speaking out against this, because again, Judaism is not Zionism. And I know that just from the historical perspective of it, when Zionism became a political movement in the late 1800s, lots of Jews worldwide were like, this is crazy. This is a dumb idea. This is awful. And
the original Zionists were atheists too, weren't they?
Yes.
Herzl was an atheist.
Yeah.
I'm an atheist, but God said that we get Israel.
But again, and I know you guys know this, but Jews have always been radicals. There have always been Karl Marx. You talk about guys like Howard Zinn, Emma Goldman, Chomsky,
Arno Mayer.
You
could not have an American left.
Right.
You couldn't have an American left.
It wouldn't exist without Jews. So it's incumbent on us to talk about this sort of stuff. It's incumbent on us to stand up for Palestine, as far as I'm concerned. So.
Robeson and Martin Luther King's closest advisors were Jewish, right? Yeah. So Anyway, we've gone through a lot. Scott, why don't you have the final word on this? And
Yeah, I just, as for all the protests and everything, I just, because we've said this a couple of times, it's just a reminder that this is because the state of Israel has killed 40,000 people, including 15,000 kids. The Palestinian poet and teacher Rifat Al-Arir, who actually was killed in an Israeli airstrike on December 6th, wrote his prophetic poem, If I Die, for his daughter Shaima. And the poem asks people to fly a kite in his name if he's killed, to give hope to orphan children. Today, Shaima and her husband and child were actually killed in an Israeli airstrike. And as we go forward in thinking of how to fight this slaughter, this genocide, is just remember stories like that, because they're going to be important. The people who are standing against the students on campuses and standing against Palestinians in Gaza are on the wrong side of history. And at some point we will be absolved, I believe. So
Yeah.
Up against the wall, motherfuckers.
This is a stick up.
Absolutely.
Hey, and this is the Green and Red Podcast. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching us on YouTube, hit subscribe. If you're listening to us on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. If you really like us, go to greenredpodcast.org, hit the support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And everybody misbehave, like lots of misbehaving now. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Forge for pride and deed. Here I've seen lawless, hideous, dangerous, dirty, violent.